This is the third video in the 3 types of sports series, and today we're covering coactive sports. Now, I sincerely recommend going back and watching the introduction and the first type of sport video, but if you can't be bothered, then fair enough, just sit back, relax, vibe out, it's gonna be great. For anyone joining having watched the entire series, I will cut right to it. So like I said, today we are covering the second of the 3 categories of sport. We've done precision, which was previously known as turn-based, and now we're going on to coactive sports. So what are coactive sports? Let's remind ourselves. Coactive sports are sports in which competitors perform simultaneously but independently, without direct interaction or interference with each other. In terms of what types of sports fall into this category, there's various different types, but they can really be narrowed down to a big 4, which is running, swimming, cycling, and rowing. Now, like I said, there are some other minor sports and modalities and grey area sports which we might get to, but these 4 are the big boys. So I think you can already see some commonalities among them, because most, if not all, coactive sports involve some kind of racing element, where victory is decided not by who completes a task best, like with precision sports, but who completes a task first. Now, as I've covered many times before, we know that a sport is constituted and measured across 3 key parameters: skill, physical, and competition. As we saw in the last video, precision sports prioritize and are defined by their skill, with skill universally being the highest attribute for precision sports. Coactive sports, on the other hand, are the equal opposite of precision sports, and are therefore physically dominant sports, with the physical parameter always being the highest. And this is fine, almost to be expected in fact. But if we dig deeper, what this reveals about the relationship between skill and physicality is that they are antagonistic. So by strengthening skill, you weaken physicality, and by increasing physicality, you decrease skill. And you'll be able to see how this relationship materializes as we begin to break down the characteristics of coactive sports. But just to cement your understanding on how this mechanism works in practice, I'm first going to take you through a set of simple and patronizing examples to really solidify this idea. Okay, so this handsome gentleman right here is Kim Woo-jin. He's won like 6 Olympic gold medals in archery across all the different events. This is me. I have not won 6 gold medals. I haven't won any in archery or any other sport for that matter. Now, if me and Kim competed in an archery competition, obviously I would lose. But even if I tried to stack the odds in my favour by, like, for example, removing the sights off his bow, or making the target smaller, or pushing the target further away for him, obviously, I bet I would still lose. Why? Well, because I'm only increasing the level of skill, and he outclasses me so severely when it comes to skill in archery that I can make it as hard as I want, I'm still going to lose. Now, let's imagine that we run the competition again, but this time he gets to have all of his sights, the targets are the same size and distance, and everything's the same, but our old mate Kim has to run a 400 meters at maximal effort and straight away have to shoot with no rest. Well, provided he even makes it to the bow, I feel pretty good about my chances of, or maybe not winning, but at least missing by less of a margin. Because now the competition is still unfair, but now I've increased the difficulty on a physical axis, not on a skill one, and so now I'm able to generate a far greater advantage. So that's the example for a precision sport. To determine if they really are antagonistic pairs, let's see if this also works for a coactive sport. So this is Quincy Hall. He's the current reigning 400 meter Olympic champion. And this is me. Once again, I am not. If me and Quincy had to run a 400 meters, he would completely annihilate me, of course. But even if I started with a 10, 15, 20, probably even a 50 meter head start, I still think that he would win quite comfortably. Why? Well, again, because you're making the race more challenging along a physical axis, and Quincy has physique for days. However, if we changed the game and made it so that Quincy had to shoot an arrow and place it somewhere, anywhere within the legal scoring zone, I believe my chances of winning go up dramatically, even if I start from the same starting point as him. Once again, this is because now the race becomes challenging on a skill level, not just on a physical one. So as you can see, making a precision sport physical makes it exponentially harder to express the skill, and making a coactive sport excessively technical cripples its ability to maximally exert an athlete's physicality. So in the precision sports video, I started by outlining all of the characteristics of precision sports before diagnosing them as symptoms of maximal pursuit of skill. However, in this video, seeing as I've already confessed the true nature of coactive sports, we can actually try and do it in reverse. So let's explore the traits of coactive sports, and while doing so, ask ourselves, what do coactive sports do that demonstrate a maximal optimization for physical exertion? Now, I know it isn't very scientific to determine a result and then look for evidence that supports it, but I did that all through university, and look at me now. So, let's begin. The first characteristic of coactive sports is minimalism. And by minimalism, I'm referring to both an environment and equipment. You see, most coactive sports, particularly the big four, are performed just on flat land or flat water. And what I mean by this is that for coactive sports, terrain is rarely an obstacle. This isn't the case for the other types. Think of gymnastics, for example, and all their different apparatuses, or golf with its bunkers and ponds and trees. Even for sports like discus and hammer, it's not just about throwing as far as possible. You have to do so while staying within the throwing circle thing. And even tennis. Tennis has this great big net in the middle. What's all that about? And you can't just serve the ball wherever. It needs to be served into the designated serving box. All of these restrictions require skill to navigate and to overcome, and they limit maximal physical expression, whereas simple, flat ground or water offers no impediment to an athlete trying to exert themselves maximally. Another way that sports add complexity, aside from through terrain, is through equipment. Once again here we can highlight golf and the 3,000 different types of clubs, or pole vault, or shooting. Every sport that has an external instrument requires from the athlete an added level of mastery over said object. And in contrast, coactive sports are usually just the human body operating on its own. And here it becomes painfully obvious that rowing and cycling use equipment, and that athletics have hurdle events, which are clearly an example of terrain modification, etc., etc. And so first let's address hurdle events. Now with hurdles, we have to keep in mind that these events are subsidiary events of the flat events. In some way, the existence of the 400-meter hurdles or the 110-meter hurdles is contingent on the existence of the 400 flat and the 100 flat. And when it comes to cycling and rowing, of course these can be complicated pieces of equipment which require a significant amount of skill to wield effectively. However, I don't think that learning to ride a bike or to row requires any more skill than learning the proper technique to sprint. They certainly don't require the same level of skill that swimming does. I mean, if you don't think they are minimal, velodrome bikes don't even have gears or brakes. They are as minimal as they can possibly be while still making the sport possible. In other words, the only way you could make it more minimalistic is to not have the event at all. And finally, it's important to keep in mind that just because a category of sport maximizes one attribute doesn't mean it eradicates the other. Remember that to be considered a sport, you need to feature at least somewhat in every category. And this brings me to my second characteristic, which is a singular simultaneous event. Now obviously, athletes in a competition don't just run or swim or cycle once. There's heats, quarterfinals, semi-finals, finals. But what I mean by a singular event is that when you do get to the final, it's one isolated all or nothing attempt. This isn't really the case with precision sports, because here you perform the action multiple times at every stage in the competition. Now, the way that this maximizes physical exertion is that when you only have one chance, one opportunity, athletes understand that they need to recruit every ounce of strength and perform at their highest possible level, if not beyond. There isn't a second chance. In precision sports, athletes do have the luxury of being able to salvage a poor attempt or strategize the course of their competition in relation to the performances of their opponents. And this is also where the simultaneous nature of the sport emerges. Aside from it being more visually exciting and time efficient to have all athletes run at the same time, running simultaneously can also raise an athlete's performative ceiling and force them to go faster, as they have direct visual feedback of their performance. In addition, especially when it comes to racing, the simultaneity of the event can trigger deep primitive instincts of chasing or fleeing, possibly even increasing the levels of adrenaline, which further extend your performance threshold. Finally, competing simultaneously is also essential because of the fact that coactive sports tend to be racing sports. Like I said earlier, it isn't the person who does it best, it's the person who does it first that wins. And you can only determine this fairly if everyone competes at the same time. Alright, we are flying through these characteristics. Okay, next one. Minimal decision making. Now, I don't know if it was Einstein or Newton that said, for every minute you run, your IQ drops 10 points. True story. And look, I'm not the cleverest person at the best of times, but if I was running my heart out in a 1,500 meter race and I was giving it my all on the last lap, I probably couldn't even tell you my name, let alone make any kind of complex decision like you find in other sports, like pass versus shoot, or cross court versus down the line, or any other performative related decision. You see, in sports in general, the more you exert yourself, the more mentally challenged you become. So if you're a sport that wants to maximally physically exert your athlete, you simply can't force them to undertake any complex cognitive processing. I think this idea is best exemplified by rowing, as they have found a neat little solution to this dilemma, and they call him Henry. Well, at least the Brits do, because I'm referring to the coxswain. Now, the role of the coxswain is to steer the boat, set the pace, and otherwise communicate any other information the rowers might need. Think about it like this. Rowers would rather have a whole extra human being in the boat that does nothing physical, rather than have to keep track and coordinate all the tactical elements of a race themselves. And you might be surprised to hear that despite my fridge-like back and bulging shoulders, I have never actually rowed. However, I wouldn't be surprised if with a competent coxswain, a crew could quite comfortably perform well with a blindfold. What other sport can you say that for? How much skill does it really take if you don't even have to see? Because ultimately, to a very large extent, the only thing that runners, swimmers, cyclists and rowers have to think about is putting one foot or one arm in front of the other and doing nothing else. The fewer complex thoughts or decisions they have to make, the more they will be able to concentrate on their performance. So, okay, by now I hope that the general architecture of coactive sports is starting to take shape. We only have a couple more attributes to run through, and the next one is one of the most crucial aspects of coactive sports, but happily probably the easiest to explain. You ready? The next characteristic is that coactive sports are continuous. This is to say, they have no halves, rounds, quarters, breaks, etc. It goes from beginning to end without any interruptions. And the reason for this is, and tell me if I've lost you, you get more tired if you don't take a break. Make sense? Good. Right. Now we're going to move on to the next attribute, which is slightly trickier to explain, and that is scalability of effort. What I mean by scalability of effort is that athletes can incrementally increase their effort and performance without learning any new skills. And I'm going to provide some nuance in a second to get the point across, but the general premise is the following. The only way to run faster is to run faster. The only way to cycle further is to cycle further. The only way to row faster, same again. Just get more powerful, more durable muscles. I know this sounds reductive, but let's compare it to, let's say, tennis. How do you get better at tennis? Hit the ball harder? Okay. Serve better? Sure. Return better. Forehand, backhand, volley, lob, movement, drop shots. What about football? Passing, dribbling, vision, shooting, pace, defense, mentality. See what I mean? Let's say you're a sprinter. You can definitely work on multiple aspects of your sprinting. Your reaction time, your start, your acceleration period. Or for swimming, you can improve your kicks, your turns, your underwaters. But ultimately, all of these things are part of a singular whole. Every improvement you make in swimming contributes to being a better swimmer. Every improvement you make as a sprinter contributes to you being a better sprinter. This isn't necessarily the case for other types of sports. Put it this way, these people aren't professional footballers. In fact, they are nowhere near the level. These two bellends, on the other hand, play or played for the two best teams in the world. And this guy is the best player to ever live in his prime. Ultimately, what this tells us is that the best swimmers are the best swimmers, and the best runners are the best runners. But the best football players might not be the best football players, and improving your passing or shooting doesn't give you any real guarantees of actual football improvement. Whereas for coactive sports, if you keep improving, you'll keep getting faster, and if you keep getting faster, you'll keep improving. Now, don't misunderstand me. This doesn't mean that it's easy to improve coactive sports. In fact, it's probably quite the opposite. At the elite level, it can take years of unbearable training to shave even a quarter of a second off your time. And for a footballer, it can all just click one day. Or they can just change managers or positions and suddenly everything falls into place for whatever reason, and they're the best in the world. So it's by no means easy to improve in coactive sports, but it is simple, and there's a big difference. So this brings us to our final point, the defining characteristic which makes all of the others we've discussed possible, and the foundational trait of coactive sports, which is, drumroll please, natural cyclical movements. Essentially, the idea here is that repetitive and organic movement patterns are the perfect foundation through which to channel maximal physical exertion. So I guess this is kind of like 2 points in one. You have the natural organic side and then the cyclical aspect. So let's begin with organic. Running especially, but also to some extent swimming, is a natural movement which all animals, not just humans, do in the wild. They are the most simple movements that humans can execute with little to no complexity. And as we've mentioned, having such meager technical requirements allows more physical exertion to be channeled through it. So okay, let me give an example. I'm sure it happens many times that gymnasts have to abandon a workout or move on from a specific motion pattern or skill because they were too tired. This doesn't mean they were too tired as in panting with their hands on their knees, but simply that they can't recruit enough energy to get the height, momentum or rotation needed for whatever skill they're trying to do. If a runner or a rower or a cyclist or a swimmer says they are too tired, then they can either perform that action slower, or if they can't do that, you need to get the swimmer out of the water because they're going to drown. A gymnast can't really do a certain skill slower. They can do a completely separate, easier skill that doesn't involve as much energy or whatever, but they can't just do the same skill just in an easier way. In that sense, there is no regression from coactive sports because they are the simplest movements a human can really perform. Another way to think about it is through a term that many of you might be already familiar with, which is the idea of yips, Now, yips is predominantly a golf term used to indicate a sudden and unexplained loss of ability to execute certain skills, usually in experienced athletes. Experienced athletes meaning people that could already execute those skills quite confidently before the onset of yips. Now, this doesn't just apply to golf, but also sports like tennis, gymnastics, diving, basketball, baseball, lots of sports.
Is people I've trained with, they sometimes get up onto the board and they find themselves unable to even jump off, let alone do like really complex flips and stuff. You want to do it and everything in your head says like, I can do it because you've done it 1,000 times before. Sometimes these mental blocks just like come in, and that can happen when you're a kid, it can happen when you're Olympic medalist. That does end careers.
Now, these yips can be completely disarming. This is fine and it's perfectly natural. But here's where I need to point out that this has never in the history of time happened with running or any other coactive sport. No one gets the yips for running or swimming or cycling. This doesn't exist. You might not be in the right headspace or feeling loose enough to do a PB, that's fine. You may not be in the mood to run or to swim. But no one who hasn't been on My 500-Pound Life sincerely doubts their ability to physically carry out the action of running. Why? Because it's the simplest, most natural movement imaginable. You simply cannot overthink it. So okay, I think that's clear enough. Let's move on now to the second part of the point, which is the cyclical aspect of the movements. The idea here is that there is no movement quite as good at facilitating physical exertion as a movement which is infinite. Running doesn't have a beginning or an end. Well, sorry, I guess it does have a beginning, but it has no end. You just choose to stop. A backflip has an end, a javelin throw has an end, a putt has an end, but running, swimming, cycling and rowing can go on forever because the end of the movement is identical to the beginning. A sport can only be as physically exertive as its pattern of movement allows. You can't tire yourself out doing high jump because once you land on the mat, the high jump is over. You can then do another high jump, but it's a whole separate iteration of the action. In coactive sports, each stride isn't considered a run. The run is the continuous procedural action. In this sense, running is an infinite sport, and this is perfect because you can set arbitrary distances like 100, 200, 400, etc., and calibrate your exertion based on said distance to deliver maximum performance. We can link this to the previous point of simple movements because it's possible to imagine a cyclical movement but which is very technically demanding, like a back handspring chain. But this is a very unnatural movement which would require a lot of skill and technique, making it very difficult to reliably express your maximum physical output for any significant length of time. Running, swimming, cycling and rowing are not only infinite sports, but they are simple enough that they can easily channel an individual's maximal physical exertion. Okay, those are the characteristics of coactive sports, or at least the main ones anyway. I'm sure you could find an excuse for many, many more. But anyway, by now you better have a good understanding of how coactive sports work, because I'm going to move on now to evaluating these sports numerically. And that means heading to our SBC graphs. Now we're going to start with physical exertion, as it's actually not extremely straightforward to determine. Now, as we've clearly and repeatedly mentioned, coactive sports inherently optimize for maximal physical exertion, and I stand by that. However, if you remember the formula for physical exertion, it is intensity over time. Now, I believe without any doubt that all coactive sports get a 10 for the intensity component of the formula. However, not all of them allow enough time for that intensity to result in potential total physical exhaustion. And the sports or events that do this are admittedly a relatively low number. I'm particularly looking at you, 100-meter sprint, and you, 50-meter freestyle. And I think there's some type of velodrome event which is also would qualify under these conditions. I'm not sure which, they'll have so many ridiculous names. One of them for sure though. I think sprint? I don't know. Now I'm not saying that because they don't allow for total physical exhaustion that makes them low scorers in the physical exertion parameter, but rather I'm really just separating between the 9s and the outright 10s. And this is actually really promising because with the precision video, which those sports optimize for skill, I said that not only would skill be their highest attribute, but it would have the lowest range. And because the lowest value I can conceive a coactive sport having within the physical parameter is 8, then this seems like it would also hold for this category. I also said in the precision video that while precision sports were defined by their skill, they were distinguished by their physicality, meaning that while they had the lowest range for skill, they have the highest range for physicality. And this makes sense because, as we've seen, skill and physicality are antagonistic to each other, and increasing one means decreasing the other. So I feel quite confident that coactive sports meet the first part of the claim, which suggests that physical exertion is their most dominant attribute and the one with the lowest range. But does this then mean that skill has the highest range and therefore the most variety? Well, let's find out. When it comes to determining the skill level of coactive sports, instinctively rowing and cycling might immediately jump out as the top contenders because they have to channel their effort through an external vehicle, and it is clear that in adverse conditions with the most specialized equipment, it can get quite complicated. However, aside from these fringe cases, I don't believe that cycling is any more technically demanding than certain modalities and the performative extremes of other coactive sports. The example I would point to here is sprinting. Now, sprinting exists at the performative extreme of running in terms of speed, and elite sprinting actually demands a very specific technique that is very different to regular running and that needs to be trained scrupulously through loads of specific drills and repetitions to really crystallize into one's muscle memory. And I don't think there's much to separate it, at least technically, from cycling and from rowing. And so this leaves just one sport, which is the clear frontrunner when it comes to technical demands within coactive sports. And that would be swimming. For me, swimming is definitely the most technical of all coactive sports. In fact, swimming correctly, it's almost like learning a language. You either learn as a kid or it's going to be a real uphill battle. There are a multiple of reasons to explain why this could be, but I think an important one to point out is that although swimming is a natural movement, it's not a particularly natural movement to humans, and it's certainly not one that we're really optimized to perform. So developing the proper technique to swim most efficiently can be really challenging. And because I don't have the knowledge or time or interest, frankly, to dive into what specifically makes swimming so technical, the best way to prove my point is through an example, which brings me to one of the most obscure but remarkable sports featured at the Olympics, which would be the sport of modern pentathlon. Now, modern pentathlon includes obviously 5 sports, and those are running, shooting, horse riding up until 2024, but it's now been replaced by obstacle course, fencing, and swimming. Now, immediately this combination of sports should be interesting to this channel because it is the only sport that combines precision, coactive, and interactive sports. But the unique thing about pentathlon is that the overwhelming amount of successful athletes actually come from swimming. Now, initially, this can seem very unexpected given the variety and rarity of the sports that it features. I mean, fencing, extremely technical sport. Shooting, again, it doesn't get more precision than shooting. Horse riding, as well, very niche. And then, on the other side, you have running, which is far more popular than swimming and so would logically have a larger pool of elite athletes to draw from. But no, swimming is far away the most popular origin sport for elite pentathletes, to the point where it almost feels like a prerequisite if you want to achieve any type of success in the sport. And what we find is that swimming's combination of not only high skill cap, but also challenging learning curve alongside very strenuous physical demands makes it the most impactful sport of the five and the one that all of the winners / best athletes come from. And this is only partially true. It's not all down to swimming's characteristics that make it the most influential sport. There are other factors at play that contribute to its dominance. Because, as it happens, a few of these sports, actually all of these sports that aren't swimming, are significantly handicapped, which really cripples their influence and potential for impact for athletes coming from the other sports. In fact, remind me to do a video about pentathlon. I think it's really interesting and I would love to break down and explain each sport, what their place in the competition is, how they are so handicapped. And yeah, I don't think it's a sport that gets much love, rightly or wrongly, but I'd love to find out which it is. Anyway, yes, swimming, definitely very techy, the most of all the coactive sports, and that's just for freestyle swimming. Imagine adding the complexities of all the other strokes. So I'm fairly certain that swimming is by far the highest skill of all of coactive sports. But then which is the least? And the question about the least skill expressive coactive sport is quite tricky. We are really in uncharted waters, so I've put it at the end because I'm going to start saying some things that I'm not even sure I believe and then make me question my own sanity. So anyway, here we go. Let's look at running. And I don't mean sprinting, we've already covered that and it definitely has some skill to it. I'm talking about regular jogging running. The kind you'd probably see in the 800 meters / 1500 meters upwards. Now here's my dilemma, okay? And I don't know how to feel about this. One of the foundational maxims of this whole entire exploration is that for a sport to be considered a sport, it needs to feature at least somewhat, even if it's with a 1, in all 3 of the skill, physicality, and competition categories. I stand resolutely by this rule, and I'm therefore confronted with the significant conundrum when it comes to the skill expression of long distance running. How sure are we that this isn't a zero skill sport, and therefore, of course, not a sport at all? How are runners exactly expressing skill when they run the marathon? Is it not just purely physical? Should there, or in fact why aren't there, swirling controversies over whether marathon running or 10k should be included in the Olympics? And look, I guess I'm slightly exaggerating here. There's an argument to be made that stride length, foot strike, arm swing, posture, and all of these other considerations contribute to giving distance running a generous 1 for skill. And I am perfectly happy to concede that 1. But I do think it's important to point out that running's legitimacy as a sport is completely unchallenged and unquestioned. And because it's such a physically demanding sport, we generally dismiss or ignore how low skill it really is. In fact, the only things that are organically simpler to humans than running, from a skill perspective anyway, are probably walking, chewing, maybe breathing. I struggle to understand how, in spite of running's mind-numbing simplicity, we instead choose to levy our criticisms towards more sedentary sports, but which undoubtedly have an incomprehensibly higher skill cap than anything that runners could possibly imagine. And speaking of walking, lots of people make fun of race walking for, well, essentially being walking included in the Olympics. But I'd argue that running is in fact right there with it. In fact, I would say that walking is probably less physical than running for sure, but also more skilled, making it altogether a more well-rounded sport, with running teetering far more on the edge of specializing too much that it forfeits its label as a sport at all. So, okay, there we go. That is essentially coactive sports. A nice controversial claim to end it on, but hopefully thought-provoking nonetheless, even if the thoughts it provokes resemble more, how can this guy be such an idiot? You know, I'll take whatever I can get. Next up, interactive sports, the grand finale, and admittedly the most interesting kind of sports. So I'm looking forward to it. See ya.